as you'll see at several points throughout this hour, does continue to inflict enormous economic damage around the world. The International Trade Center, it's a joint agency of the United Nations and the WTO, which focuses on SMEs, says that global exports of leather products and footwear around the world fell by over 20% in March compared to a year earlier. Exports of seafood products and vehicles also fell by 11% and 8% respectively. But import demand has also fallen significantly in Africa, according to the ITC, with year-on-year declines of 20% and 26% respectively in the textiles and garment sectors. Of a bigger concern at the moment, however, is the fact that 24 countries worldwide have export restrictions of one kind or another on food products during this pandemic. And remember, just last week, the World Food Programme warned that the number of people at risk of starvation around the world would double to over 260 million. A few hours ago, I spoke to Dorothy Tembo. She's the acting executive director of the International Trade Center. I started by asking her how intra-African trade within the continent, has changed since COVID-19 landed on our shores.
We're seeing the demand side reducing. For instance, you have the textiles and footwear sectors showing a 23% decline on the export side, as we are seeing in the manufacturing sector a 14% decline. On the other side, on the import, we are seeing on the vehicle side approximately a 14% decline. What is it that's happening in Africa in particular? We have seen that Africa as well is one that is being negatively impacted. We have undertaken a business survey which shows 74% of the respondents actually coming back and saying they are being affected in a very heavy way. And this is something that we really have to pay attention to. Simulations that we have done is that just 2020 would see Africa losing export revenue of close to $1 billion if we go on at the pace we are going.
Indeed. The Secretary General of the CFTA Secretariat, Kelemene, he was on record earlier this week as saying that the CFTA that was supposed to be implemented from the 1st of July, that won't happen given the circumstances. What's your reaction to that?
I should say I had a bit of conversation with Secretary General some few weeks ago, and I must admit that in the conversation that I had with him, he was very, very keen to move forward with the implementation to the extent that he could, recognizing that these are really challenging times for everyone. So for them to have taken that decision, I believe there must be very good reasons that, you know, they feel perhaps would not be so supportive to the process to ensure that they get to a point where the operationalization is taken. Even the logistics of trying to get to the negotiating table themselves, I think, could be challenging in the current circumstances because you have varying degrees of infrastructure being available to the different countries.
Right.
So the option I see, the regional integration efforts being applied in the context of COMESA, SADC, ECOWAS, and many others could be the route that the countries use to keep this momentum going, because it has to be there. Trade has to continue.
Right. Speaking of trade, though, African countries cannot afford to pull off the same kind of monetary and fiscal stimulus that we're seeing in the EU, for example, or in the United States, for that matter. So trade might be the one way that we can actually essentially make sure that economies and jobs are preserved as we get through this crisis. But given the fact that a lot of our economies tend to be very similar, right? Agriculture, for example, is a very big part of GDP. How big of a stimulus can we really get through trade and the CFTA post-COVID?
I think here perhaps, of course, the stimulus is an important element of what has to happen for Africa to push forward. And I think the efforts that are being made at present by the different entities or individuals that have also been identified to lead on behalf of Africa are critical to this process. But I think it has to do also with ensuring that Africa is already starting to better understand their situation and see how they can reposition themselves within the COVID period, but also looking towards the recovery. What exactly do I mean by that? Africa needs to better understand their production processes, better understand the products that can be produced, better understand where the diversification efforts have to be made, and indeed better understand the diversification of the markets. Because you can have as large a stimulus package as you can, but if you're not really well organized to make sure that you're positioning yourselves to take off when that opportunity is available, it will become extremely difficult for Africa to make that leap.
Let's move on to Nigeria there. The founder of a tech startup in that country, Ebuna Okubanjo, is stepping in to help after watching with dismay as his home city of Lagos entered a